again.
Okay, so let's see if this works any better. Do you see my title screen now?
We do, and it's the correct size. Try switching to the next screen. There it is. Perfect.
Looks good.
How about here?
Looks good.
Yep, looks good.
All right. All right, so we were asking the question, are comets disasters? We said they could be. This is a good example. Each of these blast marks are in fact the size of the planet Earth. And so it would be a bad day. One of the first examples of comet art, if you will, is the Mangdui silk book, which is a silk book discovered in a Han Dynasty archaeological site in the early 1970s. And it occurred while they were excavating 3 sealed tombs from about 168 BC. This book that was found in the tomb was a swath of skin about 1.5 meters long, and it had knowledge of historical comets to the Chinese, and it contained 29 drawings of different comets with their tails, and it had an accompanying description that almost certainly qualifies as the first defined comets based on actual observation. Of the 29 comets recorded, 18 had never been identified before. Each of the comets is identified by name with notes or prognostications about each one. The connotations for each of these comets was mostly negative. They described a general dies, a rebellion in the state perishes. There were a couple that were positive, such as appearing in the spring means good harvest, a bumper crop. In the summer means drought, in autumn means flood. One of the other classic descriptions or notations in art is the Bayou Tapestry, which is a 231-foot-long embroidery in 8 colors that depicts the history of the Norman invasion and the conquest of England in 1066. And it really makes the point about how comets were felt the adumbration of things to come that were not good. You're probably familiar with the Bayou Tapestry. It starts with the visit of Harold to Normandy in 1064. And in this cut from it, in this embroidery, it shows a messenger coming to King Harold and telling him about the possibility of the invasion and about the fact that there's a comet overhead. And you can see over here on the left side are all sort of like a comet party of people observing the comet with its multiple tails overhead on the left. Of course, the left being sinister. And down below, it's essentially foretelling the fact that the invasion fleet was coming to invade England. This is the Lucerne Chronicle is a 3-volume Swiss manuscript that refers to history and legends of the cantons of Switzerland. And you can see overhead there were actually 2 comets. A comet was considered to be a bad star. That's where we get the term disaster. And supposedly marking the bad events related to the Ottoman threat. And in it you can see raindrops of blood, deformed children, 2-headed cattle, and these were all considered obviously to be bad omens. Later on in 1530, Peter Appian was a German astronomer, and he was the first to make the observation that the tail of a comet always points away from the sun. And he used his descriptive art to describe what he was seeing and how the tail moved with the progress of the comet around the sun. In contrast, Ambrose Paré, the surgeon, his view of comets were totally different, not very scientific at all, but mostly allegorical. He talks about the comet as being a sword of heaven, and that it's a bad sign from the gods that something horrible is going to happen. In Julius Caesar, Calpurnia is the wife of Julius Caesar, has a really bad night of nightmares, and makes the comment, when beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. And so this theme of bad things happening to great people, particularly kings, is continuing to be a theme over 1600 years after the Chinese manuscript. This is a woodcut that depicts an earthquake in the city of Constantinople. It's called Frightening Signs of Wonder with the Terrible Earthquake which Happened in the Cities of Rossana and Constantinople. It's a hand-colored woodcut by the German Hermann Gall, and the earthquake that it's referring to was from 1566. In it, you can see again the bad star, which is a star with a tail on it that moves inappropriately compared to the normal sun and moon. You can see the collapse of churches, cathedrals, people running in the streets, running down to the shores, with buildings collapsed in this woodcut. An interesting sidelight is because of the fact that comets were an adumbration of things to come, it was sometimes put into formal portraits that were painted. And this is a good example of that, the Great Comet of 1577. And this is a guy named Richard Goodricke. And he reached adulthood in that year, and he wanted to have himself pictured with the omen to show that he was upfront with it, he could deal with it, and nothing bad would happen. This is a blow-up of that comet with the quote, "Deor sum nunquam," or never downward. The Great Comet of 1577 over Prague was, in fact, a feature of numerous works of art because of the magnitude of it. This is a comet that was seen on November 12th of that year. Johannes Kepler's mother brought him to a hill to look at the comet, and it so inspired him that he became fascinated with astronomy and astronomical research. The tail for this comet is said to have spread across the sky. It passed very close to the sun and was seen immediately after it came back around the sun, and hence it was so brilliant that it was described as being as bright as the moon and visible during the day. The greatest comet of the 17th century, this photo in this painting here, over Rotterdam. of the 18th century was is here said to be equal to Venus in brightness, and had 6 major tails. And the interesting thing about this comet is that it was seen on different parts of the Earth, and people drew pictures of it, and it sort of confirms what it looked like. So these are 2 different pieces of work from a couple of thousand miles apart, depicting the same tail of the comet. So we know that the art can be used to confirm data. Halley's Comet, of course, is probably one of the most well-known comets of all, with a periodicity of about 87 years. Because of the fact that it's named after Halley, because he predicted, after observing similar courses of past comets, then in fact he predicted when it would come again, and it's been called Halley's Comet when it came back in 1758, even though he had already died in 1742. And this is another great comet of 1858 with its really tremendous tail. I'm not sure why I've got these blue streaks on my screen. I don't know if you're seeing them as well, but I apologize for that. So the depiction of fires and fire disasters is, in fact, a great theme in art, particularly European art. This is a woodcut that dates to the 17th century, showing the use of fire hooks. These were being used to fight a fire in Tiverton, Devon, England. They were used to tear down parts of the building so that you could pour water on them, and to try and knock off the pieces of roof that were burning, to try and help put it out. This is a 1670, if you will, a business card of a John Keeling, who showed his fire engine in use, which was an interesting way to pump water onto a fire. The pumps were managed by 4 people manning the pump, and he was able then to direct the flow of water onto the fire. Certainly there have been several great fires in history. The Great London Fire of 1666 is one of those. And this is called Ludgate in Flames, with St. Paul's Cathedral in the distance. The Great Fire of London was a major fire that swept through the central parts of England on a 3-day course. It gutted the medieval city of London inside the city walls, and it burned through most of the suburban slums. It burned down 87 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the buildings that belong to the city authorities. And it's estimated that it destroyed 70,000 homes. It said that it started in a bakery that was located next to a building that caught fire. And the way that fires in this era was, in fact, to create fire breaks by blowing up other buildings. And it was delayed because the mayor had trouble making the decision, and then it was already too late to deal with. This is another depiction of the Great Fire in the style of the Dutch school. This depicts the old London Bridge, various houses, drawbridge. The detail is actually quite phenomenal in this painting, and it's fascinating actually to look at all the detail in these demonstrations. This is a map that showed the extent of the fire in central London in 1656. When people evacuated away from the area, again, they would gather, and this painting really looks more at the effect on individuals, on people, rather than the event itself, which is an interesting highlight of many of the works of art related to disasters. If you go to London today, the Monument to the Great Fire of London, which was designed by Christopher Wren, memorializes that great fire. Now, New York has had its share of disasters. This dates back to 1776, the terrible fire of New York. It burned through the night in 1776. It occurred during the occupation of New York City by British troops during the American Revolutionary War. So there were all sorts of political ramifications because each side accused the other. The Brits accused the colonists of starting the fire, and the colonists accused the Brits of starting the fire. And it shows the fire engulfing these large, elegant estates type buildings. And it's thought it might represent Broadway. This is a map of New York City in 1776, showing the area of the Great New York City fire. And it's sort of interesting because the World Trade Center was later located right in this area. So it actually burned the area where the World Trade Center would be 200 years later. 1835, the burning of the houses of the Lords and Commons. This event occurred actually in 1834, and it was the biggest fire in London since the Great London Fire in 1666. And this started because of the burning of tally sticks. So historically, the way records were kept were a form of stick. They were wooden sticks, and they would write down the name of a person who paid money and the name of the person to whom the money was given to as a record of a transaction. And then the stick would be broken down the middle, and it would always have a unique kind of edge that would only fit into the edge of the other half of the stick longitudinally. And these were tally sticks, and they were used for hundreds of years throughout Europe, and even versions of it in Asia. And once they were used and the deal was over, there was no real need for that stick. And so it'd pile up at the city treasurer's office, and it was decided to burn them. And they decided to burn like 200 years worth of these tally sticks, and it overcame the restrictions in the chimney where it was being burned in the House of Commons, and it created this giant fire that lasted most of the night. And J.M.W. Turner, of course, who was an artist who was very interested in light and the effects of light and its reflections, had a couple of attempts at depicting this event. And this shows a detail of that painting. Again, the detail is incredible, and the tremendous amount of variations in coloration are really amazing. He was considered one of the most outstanding landscape artists in the 19th century. And he became less involved in the details of objects and landscape, and mostly his attention to the effects of light and color as it interacted with atmospheric elements. And I think that this is clearly evident in this painting. This is another of his paintings of the burning of Parliament. This was first exhibited in 1835, and it shows the same scene, but further down the Waterloo Bridge over here. And you've got spectators along the sides of the shore of the river watching as it burns. And this is in the Cleveland Museum. There are other depictions of it that are in a totally different style. This almost has a more modern kind of feel to it, and yet it is a contemporary of the event of the actual fire. This is another one by William Heath, which shows, again, interesting detail. You've got observers in their houses watching the fire burn from their own apartments or houses. And there's even the detail of all the way right here in the center of the painting is the fire dog of the fire station that came to work on the fire. As I recall, was Chance. William Heath actually has a painting, a full painting of the dog. Back on this side of the pond, this is a painting in the American school style, which was really an attempt at describing the realism of situations, being objective and less romantic. And this was a fire in the New York World Building, which is right next door to the New York Times building. This was an area where many of the newspapers in downtown New York were located. It occurred during a sleet and snowstorm. At least 5 people died in this fire. There was a thick wall that separated this building from the New York Times building. There was a single staircase up the middle of this building for 5 floors. And if anybody were to escape, they had to run through the fire to get out. The big problem in New York City at the time is that these skyscrapers or these higher buildings were fairly new. The tallest ladder will only reach to the 3rd floor. So people were jumping out of the windows. There was a hero of this fire who noticed that there was a wire rope hanging from one of the windows, and he noticed that that rope attached to a telephone pole. So he climbed up the telephone pole in the sleet. He was able to cut the rope and let it fall, and then people trapped, that there were 3 people in their office that were trapped, that were able to slide down the telephone wire. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire was one of those significant events that caused a tremendous number of new laws and regulations related to safety. In the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, there were hundreds of garment workers. Many of them were Italian and Jewish immigrants, and they made women's blouses under very brutal conditions. And the workspace was usually not cleaned. There was abundance of oily rags. The factory doors were locked to keep people from working and from taking breaks. And this developed as a grease fire that wound up killing 146 workers. The artist Victor Gatto, who was 18 years old at the time, actually watched this fire on Washington Place in New York City, in Green Street. And he recalled seeing the intense smoke and fire, hopeless crowds, and shrouded bodies of workers who were being recovered or who had fallen to their death from jumping out the windows. And it became a very hot political issue because these were all union workers, and unions organized a parade for the same day, which apparently had over 250,000 people attending it. And so the things that came out of that were the laws against sweatshops, New York building codes, labor laws, and again, this is the style. It's shunning idealism and showing the truth of what happened in an objective fashion. I'm going to move on to earthquake events at this time. See if I can go through these a little bit faster. This is a fascinating picture because it's called the Miraculous Revival of a Child Killed by an Earthquake. And this is from the 14th century in Italy. And here you can actually see someone breathing into the mouth of this child. And this may well be the first depiction of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation of a child killed by the earthquake. So I find that fascinating from a number of viewpoints. One of the great historical events in Europe was the Great Lisbon Earthquake. Many of you are probably familiar with that. It occurred on All Saints' Day, which was November 1st, 1755. I've learned that from exploring this earthquake that All Saints' Days are always November 1st, and that they're related to the dedication of a chapel in St. Peter's in the 9th century. The earthquake was estimated between 8.6 and 9.0 magnitude. There were 6 great cathedrals in Lisbon, and they all collapsed. The churches were all filled with people because of the All Saints' Day. And each one of these celebrated with multiples on just about every flat surface in the cathedral. And so you can imagine, as is true of most big earthquakes, that there was a fire afterwards. 30,000 people were said to have died within the first 5 minutes. The death toll in Lisbon was estimated at 40 to 90,000 out of a total population of 250,000. There was a tsunami associated with this earthquake as well. And you had 10,000 people die in Algeria and Morocco. And the fire that started essentially raged for 4 to 5 days. The impact of this was tremendous on the continent of Europe, and it had extensive treatment. It was sort of like, the 911 at the time, because it destroyed so much. It destroyed all of the records of 300 years of all the Portuguese explorers. And at the time, it was a time leading into to an Enlightenment period, which was trying to get away from the kind of religious control of people's lives. And so much of this is discussed in the literature. Candide is one of the most famous books written by Voltaire. It's a satirical novel which describes how Candide, who adhered to the Leibniz philosophy, thought that everything was perfect and good no matter what. It was always the best and the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire was, it was abhorrent for Voltaire to think about that concept. The the prime minister, when asked, so one of the untrue stories is that the prime minister, the Marquis of Pombal, was asked, what should we do about all these things that were happening? And he essentially said, bury the dead and kill living. But this apparently was incorrectly attributed to him It was really said by an older fellow who's a war hero, the former Portuguese governor of India. The other thing that Voltaire was responsible for was the poem upon the Lisbon disaster. Quote from it, this is how it starts. It starts, unhappy mortals, dark and mourning earth, a frighted gathering of humankind, eternal lingering of useless pain. Come, ye philosophers who cry, all's well, and contemplate this ruin of a world, and so forth. So this was Voltaire's attempt to attack Leibniz and his philosophy of this is the best world, everything is for a reason, the people who died must have been sinners kind of attitude. There are many etchings and woodcuts that depicted this. This is one of them, showing the marked destruction of the buildings from the earthquake and then the fires that occurred. One of the hallmarks of this was that because of the fact that there were large amounts of in the churches, there were looters that were looking for this, and it was demanded that looters would be hanged in the public squares, and this is a depiction of that from contemporaneously from that era. After the earthquake, there was a tsunami. There were 3 giant waves that occurred. It was described as occurring between 30 to 40 minutes after the earthquake. After the fires had started, people ran to the piers at the shore, thinking that they could get away from the fires, and many of them got onto boats, and many of them were overcrowded. And then when the tsunami came, most of the people in those boats perished and drowned. So this was truly a double whammy or triple whammy, as is the case with some of these great earthquakes. You get the earthquake, you get the tsunami, you get the fire, and then in certain instances, which I'll talk about later, as occurred in Japan, you get the rumors and the finger pointing. This is an intense etching of the Lisbon Harbor, showing how the boats were overturned by the tremendous waves that occurred. It transmits this feeling of chaos and disturbance in every aspect of the entire infrastructure. Almost every building, there's flames and smoke. The entire harbor is disrupted. Nothing, no place was stable or safe. And there's a number of etchings that transmit this same feeling. There's another one, the abyss of Lisbon, again showing the people being in their boats being overwhelmed by the seas, people trying to get into boats and trying to seek refuge from the fire. This is a colorized version of the waves of the tsunami coming ashore and sinking the boats. And here's another drawing that I found depicting the collapse of the buildings. So 18 days later, there was an earthquake off the coast of Massachusetts, the Cape Ann earthquake. It was thought to be a magnitude of approximately 6.3, although it's an estimate, and there was a report of a tsunami in the Caribbean related to this event. And nobody knows whether this event was stimulated by the Great Lisbon earthquake, because it came so quickly afterwards. This is a disaster where nobody died, which is nice, but the chimneys all fell down on hundreds, maybe thousands of buildings in Boston and Springfield and Falmouth, which is Portland, Maine. And if this same earthquake would occur today, it would probably cause billions of damage and billions of dollars of damage in Boston. Similar to the impact on literature, this earthquake was perceived by the residents of Massachusetts as punishment from God, behavior. And in the days after the earthquake, there were special prayer services held. There were fast days declared by the civil administrations of the cities. There were sermons and writings. And this one is a verse by Jeremiah Newland, a Boston preacher, called Verses Occasioned by the Earthquakes in the Month of November. Thy terrible hand is on the land, by bloody war and death. It is because we broke thy laws that thou didst shake the earth. So again, there's this continued impression that it's somebody's fault when a natural hazard occurs. We probably still see that even in our times. It certainly was occurring when HIV was first identified. This is a totally different approach to the an earthquake, and this is a painting that's in the Museum of Art and History in Geneva of a earthquake, a monumental version. This has more of a feeling and an emphasis on the survivors, the people who are afraid of the coming aftershocks. There's a woman carrying a baby, supporting its head, not clear if it's alive or not, but just being terrified and catching that feeling, sort of Rubenesque kind of painting. He's sort of looking up to the heavens to think maybe there's some grand reason why they're being punished. This is an interesting painting of the San Francisco fire, again with amazing detail. Certainly, I'm always amazed by how well people can paint and draw ships, but it's amazing that they do. And this one depicts the San Francisco fire by this painter, W.A. Coulter. This is an Italian painting of an earthquake in Messina, Italy. Again, looking at the survivors, the people being rescued, the blank faces of the people who are impacted by the disaster. Japan lies at the site of 3 tectonic plates, one subducting against another and another doing a slip slide against the third, and they have the 35% of all the earthquakes that occur in and around Japan. The etiology of earthquakes, according to Japanese tradition, was that there's a giant catfish living underground, and when it shakes itself, it causes earthquakes. And so giant catfishes have always been representations of earthquakes in Japanese legend, culture, and Japanese art. The color wood blocks of the times of each of these earthquakes, called earthquake catfish pictures, were circulated after the giant earthquake, the Ansei earthquake in 1855. This is a fascinating demonstration of, this is a wood print, and it shows the god Kashima, who's sentenced this giant catfish in the court, and he's pounding this capstone into the head of this catfish. And this is a helper of the god who's sort of wrestling this fish down and holding it down. It's being observed by an assembly of smaller catfishes. And these are supposed to represent earthquakes of the past. This is a Japanese woodblock print again, of the fight of people wrestling against the effects of the earthquake. The Great Cantu earthquake in 1923 was in fact a monumental event similar to the Great Lisbon or the Great Cantu earthquake resulted in the destruction of 80 to 90% of Tokyo and Yokohama. It was an earthquake, talk about bad luck. It was an earthquake that occurred while there was a typhoon sliding up the coast of Japan. And the earthquake, which was essentially a monumental kind of event that was described as lasting between 4 and 10 minutes, was considered to be a 7.9 magnitude. It occurred right at lunchtime, about 5 minutes before noon, when people were already stoking up their barbecues or their hibachis to cook lunch. So many of those spilled out. Fires started in multiple places around the city, and then the winds from the tropical storm came and actually generated a massive firestorm. 30,000 people had sought refuge from their houses in a large open area in the center of the city, which was the Army's, it was a Army uniform depot, which was no longer being used, and it was contemplated to be made into a park. In fact, they sought refuge there, and because it was lunchtime, they started making lunch and heating up food and water, and then along comes this, the winds, which created a firestorm. It also involved, when you think about it, the zoo. So here you see an elephant who's escaped from the zoo. There were other animals that escaped too. And there's good evidence that, in fact, this elephant did escape the fire. This is called a fire at the Asakusa amusement park. And you had many of the animals were trapped. They were trying to release some of them, and this elephant did get out and survive. There was, in fact, a tornado of fire that occurred in this big open space and essentially killed between 30 and 40,000 people in that one site. This is a depiction of that terrible event outdoors. Another depiction of that same event by different observers. There's a series of prints that look at some of the other effects of the earthquake. People ran away from their fires. They tried to seek refuge by jumping into water and ponds, ceremonial ponds. But the fire was so intense that the water started to boil and essentially killed people who were seeking refuge in the water. This is called the tragedy of the horses, where you had people trying to escape by crossing over smaller bridges in the city. And because the fires were multi-centric, horses would come onto the bridges from either end, and then they couldn't turn around, and then the fires would come. And many people lost their horses. This print doesn't come out that good on projection here, but this represents one of the, probably I would call the fourth disaster of the day after the firestorm, the earthquake, and the typhoon. And that is a vigilante group that was patrolling the neighborhood at night immediately after the earthquake. Because of the fact that there was tension between Japan and Korea at the time, rumors were started that Koreans were taking advantage of the disaster by committing arson and robbery and poisoning the wells. And when people look in the wells, because the earthquake had shaken the earth up so much, the water looked cloudy. And so that confirmed, allegedly, in quotes, the rumors that the wells had been poisoned. And so vigilante groups went out and started a massacre of any Koreans they found. So this rumor was essentially rampant for 2 to 3 days after the earth, and as many as at least 300 Koreans were killed, some by the actual police. And that's the official number, but there are many accounts that the actual number is somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people killed. So ever since this event, one of the main focuses of the Japanese government after disaster, after an earthquake, is to make sure that everybody has a radio and doesn't listen to rumors, but gets their information from an official source. And it's really quite an important part of their culture. And again, here's an example of bringing the disaster down to the individual level. The ruins of my house by Hokuhai Niwata. The medical response occurred in a best way as it. I don't know that they had DMATs at the time, but they certainly had the Army, which came out and put up tents in conjunction with the Red Cross. There were tremendous fundraising events throughout the world. The biggest contributor to the recovery following this event was the United States. This is a painting in the Great Cantu Earthquake Museum in Tokyo. Interesting, it was only open for many years. It was only open one day a year on September 1st. It's now open a couple of days a week, and I was fortunate to be able to visit that museum on my trip to Tokyo. And there's some remarkable paintings of the time in that museum. This is a picture of the museum, and my host, who was one of our EMS disaster fellows at the time, who was sort of a binational, whose father lived in Japan. He had never even heard of this museum, although he was a longtime resident of Tokyo, but we did find it, and it was a very fascinating place to visit. One of the reasons that it's fascinating is that there's no English written on any of the paintings or the descriptions, because after the March 1945 air raid on Tokyo, they decided to commemorate both of these events in the same museum. And so it doesn't really appeal to visiting Americans, I would imagine. So I thought I would highlight some of the quake accuracy of information following natural disasters must be confirmed. As you know, there's lots of rumors about the coronavirus going around now, many of which are not true. And it's really important to know where your information is coming from. Even if the information was in the newspaper, it doesn't mean the information is true. One of the newspapers actually reinforced the fact that Koreans had poisoned the wells. And because it was written there, people felt that it was therefore true. We know about fake news, but there's so many examples of fake news historically that we just need to be careful about our sources. Planning for double whammy and triple whammy disasters is necessary, even as some people believe it can't happen. Hazard vulnerability is a prerequisite for adequate preparation. Reconsider the use of open fires at disaster sites or in shelters, even outdoors. And the interesting thing after this earthquake and fire, where so much property was destroyed, people lost the titles to their homes and then couldn't prove to their insurance companies that they had had a loss. And so it's recommended now that you have several backup copies of your property title and keep them in different locations, preferably in different cities. Another another event here, the Scotchgap Lighthouse. This is a photograph, and I'm just showing you the photograph to make the point about painting. This is a concrete structure, 5 stories high. This base is 40 feet above sea level. And in the middle of the night, it was completely destroyed by a tsunami on April 1st, 1946. And that was manned by the Coast Guard. 5 crew were killed in this building, and 159 died in Hawaii. So this is the before picture. This is the after picture, showing the destruction of that structure and wipe out of the terrain up to 105 feet above sea level from the run-up of this tsunami. This is a painting that essentially depicts that event occurring. And it sort of makes me wonder, when this is so well known, how did the Japanese decide to build a tsunami wall along their entire eastern coast that was 30 feet tall? This is a representation of the tsunami that occurred in an Alaska Railroad yard at the time of the giant earthquake on Good Friday, 1964. They were actually putting together a train, and there were over 100 cars there, and one of the trains was picked up by the tsunami wave and carried 150 feet inland. The Haiti earthquake is sort of interesting because it highlights another form of art. This is a Haitian earthquake called Seisme by Evelyn Alcide, 2010, and it's made of, these are called flags, and this is a form of voodoo art that make flags or banners that have their depiction sewn on in beads or thread or plastic. And this one is at the UCLA Museum. Another one by Mirel de Lisme. This is called Drapeau Voodoo Art. Again, another flag with the design done in beads. In voodoo art, there are a number of specific gods that are depicted symbolically, and those are present in this painting that depicts the death after the Haitian earthquake. This is a child's earthquake painting from that same earthquake in Haiti. And it's significant because there was a Haitian cultural recovery project, and it gave children an opportunity to create art after the earthquake. The Smithsonian had a National Museum of African Art that had an exhibition in Washington, D.C. by Haitian children. And it had more than 100 paintings by children. And this was a project that was initiated by the Elizabeth Preval, who was the First Lady of Haiti. And they created a safe place for children to express their feelings through art. And the Children's Place is actually 2 art centers that initially were housed in converted school buses at 2 different locations in Port-au-Prince. The center actually has paintings both by Elizabeth Preval and also by Michelle and Joe Biden, the latter visited Haiti. Water disasters. This is one of the most famous paintings that people, or images that people see. It's called The Great Wave of Kanagawa on the Tokaido, from the 36 views of Fuji. The funny thing is that it's not a disaster. This is just a depiction of a regular wave, and the goal is to present the different views of Mount Fuji. but everybody always assumes that it's a tsunami. There are many other ways to depict this kind of event. This is a Cookie Monster version of the same painting. I thought it was cute. The Johnstown flood and fire, again, hundreds roasted alive at the railroad bridge. This is a real event. As you know, the Johnstown flood probably ranks up there in the 5 top disasters in the history of the U.S. as far as the number of people killed. And this is called the Great Konama Valley disaster, when essentially the flood, when the dam broke or overflowed and came down the valley. It brought with it hundreds of houses and debris and trees, and they all got caught up at this bridge because of the obstruction and because of the fact that it occurred where there was gas involved. The fires erupted and was responsible for many deaths at that site. But the detail here of the kinds of debris that accumulated at that bridge is incredible. Winslow Homer is one of the famous American artists, and he used to live in England, and he used to, there was a shipwreck that he used to see from where he stayed, and he was always impressed by the power and the peril of the sea. And so he has quite a few images that depict the sea, and he's a serious kind of guy. And this is one of his most popular paintings, called The Lifeline, from 1884, and it's been in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It depicted a presumably a lifesaver, perhaps Coast Guard, perhaps just a bystander, who remains nameless, or you can't see his face because of the scarf of this woman, depicting the fact that many people are rescued by faceless, nameless people who you don't even know, who are doing things that are life-saving. And they're using a technology here from ship to ship to pick this woman up out of the sea. Following Hurricane Dorian, it made me think of this painting where you had so many people in the Bahamas affected by that major hurricane. This is another Winslow Homer, 1899, after the Hurricane Bahamas. This was following a hurricane that was responsible for 3,800 deaths that year, including 3,300 in Puerto Rico. This is a watercolor, which is almost opaque. You can actually see the paper through it with the texture, and it essentially is a quiet scene from the storm, again denoting its effect on individuals. This is a contemporary Houston artist who did this painting of the issues of trying to escape from the floodwaters after Hurricane Katrina. This was presented in a urban mannerist pop art exhibit. Maritime art's another whole field. The steamship Sultana is one of the worst disasters, again, in the history of the U.S. that nobody knows about. More Americans died in this steamship fire than Americans that died on the Titanic. It had over 2,000 Union Army prisoners of war that occurred. Again, the date, April 26th, 1865. This is 2 weeks after Lincoln is assassinated. The war is essentially over. The Confederacy is releasing all these soldiers from prison camps, and they're being repatriated back to the north. Many of them had typhus. They were unable to swim, and when the boilers exploded on the ship, caused a fire, and so many of them, 1,700, died. This is a graphic painting of that incident, showing more people, I think, that were in the water than really occurred. Similarly, this is another steamship disaster. The General Slocum was a ship that was used as an outing. This was particularly bad because it was just a day outing from a large group from the St. Mark's Church in Manhattan. They had an annual excursion. It caught fire. It was mostly women and children. Again, in 1904, near the turn of the century, resulted in all sorts of rules about fireproofing bulkheads on ships, improving life jackets. There should be one for every passenger and crew member on every ship. Fire hoses that were capable of handling high pressure. All of these things were violated during this disaster. And all these deaths occurred maybe 150 to 200 feet offshore. We're familiar with the Titanic. We've all seen the movie.
Dr. Jacoby, I'm wondering, because of time, if you want to open up the floor for any questions people might have.
Okay, let me fast forward to one section at the very end, and then let's do that, okay? I'm going to fast forward through the Titanic ships and the contrast with the people versus the ship itself and the events, and mention just this ill-fated painting of the Andrea Doria crossing the World Trade Center. This was hanging on the 107th floor of the World Trade Center when the building was bombed. I'm going to skip through the tornado photos, and we'll skip through the volcanic art. We could actually do part 2. And I just want to mention disaster quilting. There's relief or charity quilts, awareness quilts that were used to raise awareness of a specific disease or disaster event. They're commemorative quilts, and it's a style of art that doesn't get very much attention, but it does bring people together. It's almost like what's happening now with the, instead of quilting, we're now making masks, separate but together in groups. And then a couple of the memorial quilts, like 9/11, commemorating the 4 flights, the HIV/AIDS quilt, which was on display here at UCSD in October 2016. And these are some of the images of those quilts that I took. These are a couple of the websites that show these quilting projects. And the last image, of course, is an artwork by this fellow in Columbus, Ohio, who was inspired by the coronavirus outbreak to create this globe of the world with the mask. And essentially, in summary, art conveys information about events, particularly before photography. It was very helpful in knowing or emphasizing what happened. It may convey subtleties about events that might otherwise be lost to memory. It transmits emotions, the gravity of incidents in their each own political way. And art has different roles in society that I've listed here. And so, to summarize, I share my interest in disaster art, and I'll open that up to questions, because Earth without art is just eh.
Thank you for that. Do any of our participants have any questions for Dr. Jacoby?
If I can get back on that.
We have Jacqueline Hansen with a hand up.
I can't put my
Question. Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
My question is, Dr. Jacoby, do you own all these works of art, or are they all kept together in one place, or what?
No, these are, I own, the only things that I own personally is I have two of those postcards from Japan of the great 1923 earthquake. Now, these are images that I've collected on the internet. I've taken pictures of myself at in various museums and in, out of books, because sometimes you can't take pictures in museums. And it's just, over the years, I've collected these images both for use in other presentations, as well as now putting them all together.
Very interesting.
And then Alan McCutcheon also had a question.
Yes, I was interested in your emphasis and illustration of how disasters can multiply and overlap. And so a great lesson that I think most of us don't think about very often, and certainly being played out now by the combination of a health and economic disaster.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that most people who are in the disaster arena are for this. I think that there was a lot of perhaps exceptional or excessive response to the discussion of secondary and tertiary events. But in fact, that's the way the world is.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Just like to thank Jake for all his service in disasters across the planet, in addition to the sharing of the art. So,
well, I appreciate that. I don't get out of the U.S. all that much, but there's a lot happening in the world, and it's interesting to be part of some of these events.
We also had Wayne Kennedy who wanted to say something.
Could unmute him.
I don't believe he's muted. Wayne Kennedy?
Wayne, you'll have to repeat.
I don't think he has an audio connection. We'll get back to him. Any other questions from anyone?
There's somebody waving at the screen. Gonna have to.
Yes, that was Jacqueline Hansen.
Yes. Can I ask another question?
Of
Go.
course, yes.
Okay. Well, Dr. Jacoby, you've seen a lot of disasters in your time. Do you have any thoughts you're willing to share with us about this current pandemic and what you envision will happen in the next year?
Well, that's certainly an interesting question, and I think it's very difficult to answer a question about what's going to happen in the next year without a crystal ball, which I don't own, although I have some pictures of them. But my take on this is that it's a new event. It's a new strain of coronavirus that happens to transmit very readily. I think it's had a major impact on the nursing home population, and I don't know how the final numbers will work out. You know, there isn't a real way to get a positive take on this, other than the fact that pretty much every epidemic that's ever occurred in the world, pandemics have all ended, and I think this will end as well, perhaps sooner than people think, in case there is a weather or humidity relationship to it. But still risks of SARS-1, and there's still risks of the MERS infection reappearing. This can, in the future, appear, even if it seems to appear. And so we've just added it to the long list of pathogens and figure out a way to prepare for and see if we can figure out a way to make a vaccine for it or an antiviral agent. And so I think that the same thing is going to happen with this outbreak that has occurred with the others.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
In fact, Alan take on it as well. Alan McCutcheon.
No, that's how I see it as well. I think the concept of it ping pong between the two hemispheres with the seasons is a real one. Certainly something that happened in 1918 with a vengeance, in 1919. So I think we all have to be prepared for that.
Jake, this is John. Any chance that you think that hyperbaric treatment would help with all these people? I mean, it's obviously you can't use a hyperbaric chamber for many victims, but has anybody explored that?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. UCSD is currently so our hyperbaric unit is currently has already submitted a proposal to the excuse me, the Human Studies Committee to be a participant in a multi-center study looking at hyperbaric oxygen to see if we can forestall or obviate the need for intubation with respiratory failure. You know, a lot of people aren't familiar with all of the different therapy, including its effects on certain chemicals that induce shock and so forth. And so there's currently some theories going around that this may be related, the coronavirus may be related to linkages and interfering with hemoglobin and oxygen transport. And so people are in the hyperbaric field and trying to figure out the best way to study it. One of the big problems with hyperbarics is that there aren't enough oxygen to know how many treatments are needed, at what pressure. There's so many variables in a treatment. And so you get together a bunch of really smart hyperbaric people who have experience in different kinds of conditions. And I think we'll get some sort of reasonable way to study this issue.
If not, let's thank Jake one more time, and I hope he gets some well-deserved rest and be back. Everybody stay home, stay safe, and stay well, please. And we'll meet again somewhere, sometime, somehow.
Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very interesting.